I remember the first time I saw the stars disappear. Wonder. One. It was during the transport from Karida, 3 weeks into my reassignment. We'd been standing in formation inside the cargo bay of an Imperial shuttle, mag-locked boots holding us steady against the deck, when the viewport shutters rolled back for just a moment. I glimpsed them then are. Thousands of points of light, scattered across the black like dust on obsidian, and then they were gone. Not because the shutters closed again, though they did, but because something vast had moved between us and the galaxy itself, swallowing the light whole, the Death Star. Moon, even through the reinforced hull of the shuttle, I felt it. A weight that pressed against my chest, a kind of gravity, that had nothing to do with mass and everything to do with presence. The trooper beside, Mayor, Church 4, 1892. I think, though I'd learned quickly that numbers mattered more than names, Hera shifted his weight slightly. His armor clicked against mine. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us spoke. We'd been conditioned at the academy not to speak unless addressed, not to question, not to wonder. But I wondered anyway, in that space behind my eyes, where thoughts still lived unmonitored. I wondered what it meant to serve on a station that could erase stars. The docking procedure took 47 minutes. I know because I counted every second of it, the way I'd been taught to count my breaths during endurance training, during pain resistance protocols, during the long nights in the barracks, when sleep wouldn't come and I'd lie there listening to the synchronized breathing of 200 other recruits who'd learned to sleep on command. 47 minutes of hydraulic hisses and magnetic locks, engaging of distant thuds that resonated through metal and bone, of waiting. When the boarding ramp finally descended, the air that rolled in carried a smell I would never forget. Recycled oxygen. Yes, every Imperial facility had that same processed quality, that faint metallic tang that spoke of filters and scrubbers, working constantly to keep biological life viable in environments designed primarily for machinery. But this was different. Older. Co-main section, Central, and Nikolai Krejci, Madera Hart, Dipston, Oil, Iron, Sharper. Namshin Risto, Darton, Alberti May, one in Sedwa, with an undertone of ozone and something else, something I couldn't name then, but would later understand as the scent of absolute power. The smell of a reactor capable of destroying worlds, its energy bleeding through every wall and deck plate, ionizing the very air we breathe. Formation. Darndero. Wichinaglat Siu. Move. Run Sim. Nansher. Od Osindarai. Nashbero. Very Nam Perkapshi Stilgano. About 2 evermore. Never war in the wall. The command came from somewhere ahead, distorted through helmet speakers, until it sounded less like a voice and more like another mechanical function of the station itself. We moved. 200 boots striking deck plates in perfect unison, a sound like thunder contained, like violence held in check by pure discipline. I was in the third row, fourth from the left. I'd been fourth from the left in every formation, since my first day at the academy. There was comfort in that precision, in knowing exactly where my body belonged, in relation to every other body around me. No, in the chaos of the Galaxia, rebellions and insurrections, planets falling, and empires rising up, there was this, my place in the formation, immutable and known. The corridor, beyond the docking bay, stretched farther than seemed possible. Grey walls. Grey floors. One and Dusteret, Reinshire and Richie Coblerin, Drakewentsen, Reda, Cabardacchayo. Grey ceiling, punctuated by light panels that cast everything in the same cold, even illumination that erased shadows and made depth, perception unreliable. I'd read once, before the academy, that human beings needed shadow and light variation to maintain psychological stability. That too much uniformity in environment could trigger deep-set anxiety responses. That text had been classified as seditious material. 6 months later, my pseudo-rat The instructor who'd assigned it had disappeared. I learned not to think about what happened to people who disappeared. But I thought about it anyway. We marched for 23 minutes before reaching Processing Station Gamma 7. The formation broke there, sorting us into groups of 10 based on our assignment codes. Mine was TK 4811. Not my name, I'd had a name once, back before Corrida, back when I was someone's son instead of someone's soldier. But that name existed in a file somewhere, sealed and irrelevant. Here, I was TK 4811, and I was assigned to Detention Block AR-23, Security Division Sector 4 part-time. The processing itself took hours. Biometric scans. Armor fitting. Mixture. Weapon calibration. Minor Carol. Mixture. Weapon calibration. Neural. Interface. Synchronization. Dirt. That last one always made my teeth hurt. A deep ache in the jaw as the helmet's internal systems aligned with my brain's electrical patterns. Learning the specific frequencies of my thoughts, so that targeting data could be fed directly into my visual cortex. It was efficient. It made us better soldiers. It also meant that every time I wore the helmet, the station could theoretically read my intentions before I'd fully formed them myself. I tried not to think about that. The armor itself was heavier than the training version we'd worn at Corrida. The plastered plates distributed weight differently, pulling at my shoulders and hips in ways that would take weeks to adjust to fully. The bodysuit underneath was temperature regulated, maintaining a constant 21 degrees Celsius, regardless of external conditions. But it felt strange too, tight in some places, too loose in others, like wearing someone else's skin. The helmet sealed with a soft hiss, and suddenly the world narrowed to what the visor allowed. A cone of vision, clear but constrained, with targeting overlays and data streams flickering at the edges. I could hear my own breathing. That was the thing nobody prepared you for. Not really. The constant sound of your own breath, cycling in and out, amplified by the helmet's interior, becoming the rhythm of your existence. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Every trooper breathed the same way. We'd been trained to, conditioned to maintain a specific respiratory rate that optimized oxygen efficiency and reduced panic responses. But knowing that we all breathed together didn't make it less isolating. Inside the helmet, you were alone with that sound, reminded with every cycle that you were a biological thing inside a machine. Thing inside a larger machine that was itself a weapon. TK 4811. Report to Detention Block AR-23. Duty roster begins at 600 station time. The voice came through my helmet, disembodied and absolute. I acknowledged with a single worder, affirmativa, and followed the nav markers that appeared in my visor display, guiding me through corridors that all looked identical, through checkpoints where other troopers stood statue still at their posts, through sections of the station where the walls thrummed with barely contained energy and the air tasted of lightning. The Death Star wasn't just large. Large was a word that applied to star destroyers, to planetary defense platforms, to the kind of structures human beings could comprehend through scale and comparison. The Death Star was something else. Or I turned Sunday, at my chair. It was large in the way that concepts were large, in the way that infinity was large not as a measurement, but as a condition. Walking through it felt like moving through the interior of some vast organism, all metal and circuitry, instead of meat and bone, but alive nonetheless. The corridors curved in ways that suggested purpose, beyond simple transportation. Out-in break. The reactor hum was constant, a frequency so low you felt it more than heard it, vibrating in your sternum like a second heartbeat. And everywhere, there were troopers, thousands of us. Tens of thousands. Thousands. Maybe more. No day. Moving through the corridors in pairs and squads, standing watch at doors and checkpoints, marching to duties and stations and posts that we understood only in fragments. The armor made us uniform, identical, each one a perfect replica of the ideal soldier, faceless, voiceless, except when protocol required speech, existing only in relation to our function. I'd thought the Academy prepared me for this. I'd thought that months of training, of having my individuality systematically eroded and replaced with obedience and precision, had made me ready. But the Academy had an end. Training cycles completed. Evaluations finished. Here, there was no end. There was only the duty, and then more duty, and then the duty after that, extending forward into a future that contained no point where I would ever be anything other than TK-4000. 800 in a battle station that could destroy planets, serving an empire that had brought order to the galaxy through force so absolute that resistance was treated as a kind of mental illness requiring correction. Detention, Block A-23, was located in the station's northern hemisphere, if a sphere could be said to have hemispheres. The nav markers led me through 3 lift systems, each one descending further into the station's interior, where the walls were thicker and the reactor hum grew louder. The block itself was a circular structure, 3 levels of cells arranged around a central command station, where duty officers monitored security feeds and life support systems. When I arrived, there were already 4 troopers on station, standing at their assigned positions with the absolute stillness that was expected of us during duty hours. TK 4811, reporting. The duty officer, an Imperial Navy lieutenant, whose uniform was so perfectly pressed it looked vacuum-formed, glanced at his datapad, confirmed my arrival, and assigned me to Post 7, 3rd level, Southern Quadrant, monitoring cells AR-2378 through AR-2394. 17 cells. 17 sealed doors, with blast-resistant, transfer-steel viewports. 17 spaces where people who'd violated Imperial law awaited interrogation, trial, or execution. I took my position. Locked my boots to the deck plate. Magnetic strips. Brought my E-11 blaster rifle to ready position. Held diagonally across my chest plate in the standard guard stance. And I stood there. The shift was 12 hours. For 12 hours, I would stand in this exact position, monitoring these 17 cells, ensuring that nobody entered without authorization, and nobody left under any circumstances. The first hour was the hardest. My legs weren't accustomed to the extended stillness yet, and the armor's weight distribution meant that small muscle groups in my calves and lower back had to work constantly just to maintain proper posture. I could feel them beginning to burn, a slow acidic ache that would intensify over the coming hours, but I didn't shift my weight. I didn't relax my stance. I'd seen what happened to troopers who failed posture inspections, sir. Assignment to waste reclamation duties, or worse, enhancement procedures that adjusted your nervous system's pain response to make standing easier. The procedures worked, supposedly. but the troopers who came back from them moved differently, like their bodies belonged to someone else. The second hour was easier. The pain had plateaued into something manageable, and I'd found the mental space where you learn to exist during long shifts. Not quite meditation, not quite dissociation, but something between them. A state where you were present enough to respond to threats or commands, but distant enough that time became elastic, stretchable, something that passed without pressing too heavily on consciousness. Around me, the detention block hummed with its own particular rhythms. The life support system cycled every 18 minutes, a soft whoosh of air pressure equalizing. The security feeds flickered through their rotation, each camera angle holding for 3 seconds before switching to the next. Somewhere below, someone was screaming. Not louder, the cells were soundproofed out, but the ventilation system carried echoes, fragments of sound that suggested the interrogation cells were active. I'd been taught not to listen, not to wonder who was screaming or why. My duty was to maintain security, not to judge the methods by which order was preserved. But I listened anyway. And I wondered. The prisoners in my section were mostly quiet. Through the viewports I could see them in their celsa, small spaces, 3 meters by 4, containing a sleeping platform, a waste disposal unit, and nothing else. Some paced. Some sat motionless on their platforms, staring at walls. One, in cell A2382, was a woman with grey hair who spent every moment I observed her writing on the wall with her fingernail, scratching words into the metal so tiny I couldn't read them from the corridor. She wrote with absolute focus, never looking up, never stopping, as if the writing itself was the only thing keeping her anchored to sanity. I wondered what she was writing. I wondered what crime had put her here. I wondered if she had family somewhere, people who didn't know where she'd gone, who waited for messages that would never come. I stopped wondering. I stopped wondering. That was safer. The duty officer made rounds every 2 hours, walking the full perimeter of the block, inspecting each trooper's stance and alertness. When he reached my post, he stopped for exactly 5 seconds, said nothing, and moved on. In the Empire's military structure, silence was approval, speech was correction. And I'd learned to prefer silence. At hour 6, the shift rotation brought fresh troopers to some positions, but mine continued. I watched them arrive, watched the troopers they replaced march out with the same perfect cadence we all maintained, and I thought about how many shifts were happening simultaneously throughout the station. How many troopers were standing guard at this exact moment, in this same stance staring at walls or doors or view screens, maintaining a security infrastructure so vast and complex that no single mind could comprehend it whole. We were cells in an organism, each one performing its function, unaware of the body's complete purpose. The reactor hum seemed louder at hour 8, or maybe I was just more aware of it. The way pain becomes more acute when you're tired. When you're tired, it wasn't really a sound downwards, in the normal sense. It was more like a vibration that your bones interpreted as sound, a frequency that bypassed your ears entirely and spoke directly to the parts of your nervous system responsible for detecting danger. Every living thing on the station felt it constantly, I thought. Every heartbeat synchronized to it over time, every breath taken in rhythm with its pulses. We were marinating that energy, letting it soak into our tissues, becoming part of the weapon ourselves. At hour 10, something changed in cell R2385. The prisoner Leramo, middle-aged, wearing the grey jumpsuit issued to all detainees, had been sitting on his sleeping platform for the entire shift, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. But suddenly he stood. Walked to the door. Pressed his face against the viewport and looked directly at me. His eyes were very blue. I don't know why I noticed that. Through the helmet visor, individual features should have been secondary to threat, assessment art, body language, hand position, proximity to door controls. But I saw his eyes first, and what I saw, there was something that protocol hadn't prepared me for: recognition. Not of me specifically. He couldn't see my face through my helmet, any more than I could normally see his through the viewport's distance, but recognition of what I was, what I represented. Watching Rash, he mouthed words. No sound reached me through the cell's sound-dampening systems, but I could read his lips well enough. 3 words repeated. Please help me. My right is for when temper, not sure what's this cell. Not right straight. Or that hurt below. I didn't move. My stance remained perfect. It turned out, I'll run about, nice to courage, and mixture. My stance remained perfect. My breathing stayed regular. Why don't I miss it or I can on? My breathing stayed regular. My finger position on the E11 didn't shift, but something behind my eyes, in that space where thoughts still lived unmonitored, something there fractured slightly. He kept mouthing the words over and over. Please help me. Was so, and something out there. Much to me. Please help me. Let's out now. Let's go. Nisho, what brow. Please help me. His hands came up to the viewport, pressing against the transparent steel, and I could see that his fingernails were bleeding. He'd been writing on his walls too, scratching something into the metal, and the effort had torn his nails down to the quick. I wanted to look away. I wanted to check my visor display, to focus on the security feeds, to do anything that would break the connection his eyes were demanding. But moving my head would constitute a breach of stance protocol. So I stared forward, which meant I stared directly at him, while he mouthed his plea at me, and I did absolutely nothing. After 3 minutes, I counted them, the way I'd learned to count everything. He stopped, stepped back from the door. Well, that's in my stared around, outline, lined up with bait and date sheet. I stepped back from the door, returned to his sleeping platform. Now, Jim, watching it down there, sat down with his back against the wall, and closed his eyes. I don't know what crime he'd committed. I don't know if he was guilty or innocent, rebel or civilian. Someone who genuinely threatened imperial order, or just someone who'd said the wrong thing to the wrong person. That wasn't my concern. My concern. Oh, well. My concern was maintaining security, ensuring he stayed in his cell, until someone with more authority decided his fate. But for the rest of that shift, I was 10 through 12. I thought about those 3 words, about how they were probably the same 3 words in every cell, in every detention block, on every Imperial station across the galaxy. Please help me. Going down. Pivisto, I want to manage it. A phrase so common, it was practically meaningless, background noise in an empire built on control and consequence. Except it wasn't meaningless to him. I wish you. And I should starting. No doubt I wrote down, well, appreciate, got. To him, in that moment, those 3 words contained everything of desperation, the fundamental human belief that if you just asked the right person in the right way, something might change. That belief was false, of course. Maries, I couldn't help him. When my little chance, ready to Kara, my Ori. I got into the alliance and I not party near light. I was a Stormtrooper, which meant I was a weapon that someone else aimed. I had no agency beyond my duty, no moral authority beyond my orders. Helping him would constitute treason, and treason was corrected through methods that made whatever awaited him in that cell seem merciful by comparison. I knew all of this. I'd been taught it, trained into it, had it reinforced through every day of my service. And yet, the shift ended at 1800 hours, station time. Weren't you? The relief trooper on Tech 6019 arrived exactly on schedule, took my post with the same perfect stance I'd maintained, and I marched out of detention block AA-23 with my E11 held at the prescribed angle and my breath cycling in-out with the same rhythm I'd learned at the academy. The barracks for security division personnel were located in Sector 4's residential zona, though residential was a generous term for spaces designed with maximum efficiency and minimum comfort. The bunks were stacked 3 high, each one barely wide enough for an armoured body, with storage compartments beneath for our duty gear, and the few personal items we were permitted. I had no personal items. Some troopers kept things hollows of families they'd left behind, tokens from their home planets, small objects that reminded them they'd been individuals once. I found that dangerous. Those things could make you remember. What should I? Around day I could go. Now still around is stone. And remembering who you'd been made it harder to be who you needed to be. The armor came off in the prep room, adjacent to the barracks. Each piece had to be removed in specific sequence. Helmet first, then chest plates, then back plates, then limb sections, and stored in our assigned lockers for daily maintenance. Without the armor, I was just a man in a black bodysuit, thinner than I'd been at the academy. Muscles developed in strange patterns from the specific demands of standing watch and marching formation. My face looked back at me from the locker's polished interior, and for a moment I didn't recognize it. It was too pale, too angular, with shadows under the eyes that suggested chronic sleep deprivation. I was 23 years old. I looked 40. I wanted notes. I less stigrain, I luxy, go. The barracks held 200 troopers, and when I entered, perhaps 30 were prison tar, some sleeping in their bunks, some sitting on the edges of their platforms staring at nothing, some cleaning their weapons with the obsessive precision that developed after enough shifts. Nobody spoke. No, we'd learned not to speak. In the barracks, conversations led to connections, and connections led to weakness. Better to maintain the same silence we kept during duty hours, to carry that isolation into our rest periods, to never give anyone enough information, to become more than a number to you. I found my bunker, middle rack, 7th row on, and climbed into it. The mattress was exactly 4 centimeters thick, sufficient to prevent pressure sores during the 6 hours allocated for sleep, but thin enough to ensure we never became too comfortable. Above me, TK 7734 breathed with the slow regularity of either sleep or death. I could never tell which until morning, when either he woke or they replaced him. I closed my eyes, began the breathing exercise designed to facilitate rapid sleep induction. 4 seconds inhale, hold for 7, exhale for 8, repeat. It usually worked within 5 minutes. Matiyota Grady shout. But that night me first night on the Death Star, I lay there for nearly an hour, listening to the reactor hum that penetrated even into the barracks, feeling the station's vast mass surrounding me, like water pressure at depth, and thinking about a man with blue eyes mouthing, "Please help me at a stormtrooper who couldn't help, who wasn't designed to help, who wasn't designed only to stand and maintain the order that kept him in that cell." I thought about it until exhaustion pulled me under into dreams where I was the one in the cell, and the one outside was someone with my face, watching with perfect discipline while I mouthed words at them that they would never answer. The days began to blur together after that first shift. Not because they were identical, though they nearly were, but because the station had a way of compressing time into something that moved differently than it did in normal space. Maybe it was the absence of natural light, the way every corridor was illuminated by the same cold panels that never dimmed, never flickered, never marked the passage from day to night. Maybe it was the work itself, the endless shifts that erased individuality until each 12-hour period became indistinguishable from the last. Or maybe it was something about the Death Star itself, something about serving on a weapon so powerful that normal concepts like time and distance stopped meaning what they'd meant before. Wake. Dress. Or when. or murder, newster, item or control, ratio, and international, duty, noon, dollar, L2, stand, noise and rest, watch, remove, armor, razor, Shell, render of insane one option, sleep, when it show, original nature, and the double wall, a claim the job, conviction, and the trigger, or be sound, repeats. My second day, I stood guard at the same post. The woman in cell, 8382, was still writing on her walls, her fingernail worn down to nothing, using what might have been blood to continue her tiny scripts. The man in cell, A2385, didn't look at me. He sat with his back to the door, facing the wall, so still I had to watch for the rise and fall of his breathing, to confirm he was alive. Third day. Heard. The woman stopped writing. Just sat on her sleeping platform, staring at her hands, turning them over and over, as if she'd never seen them before. Fourth day. The man in cell, AR-23-85, was gone. The cell door stood open during my shift, while cleaning servitors removed the sleeping platform and sanitized the walls. I didn't ask where he'd gone. I didn't ask what had happened. During his interrogation, when my shift ended, a new prisoner was there, younger, terrified, pressing their face against the viewport and screaming words I couldn't hear. Fifth day. The new prisoner was silent. They sat in the same position the previous man had sat in, back to the door, facing the wall. Sixth day. The screaming from the interrogation cells below lasted the entire shift. Different voices, overlapping, creating a kind of harmony of suffering that the ventilation system carried through every corridor in the block. Seventh day. North stay. Silence. Complete silence. Clear. Complete silence. No prisoners moved in their cells. No screaming echoed from below. Even the reactor hum seemed muted, though that might have been my imagination, or my hearing deteriorating from the constant pressure of sound against my inner ear. But the days continued. I learned the rhythms of the detention block the way. You learn the patterns of breathing are, automatically, without conscious thought, the life support cycle. I sing about the detention, and I like reader, not about the worker. The security. The exact timing of the duty officer's rounds. The specific squeak that Post 7's deck plate made when you shifted your weight just slightly to the left. The faces of prisoners who arrived, and the empty cells they left behind when they didn't arrive back. I learned which troopers could be trusted to maintain position during dual watch assignments, and which ones had a tendency to drift, their attention wandering in ways that could result in demerits. I learned that TK-9921 had been on the Death Star since its construction phase began, had watched it grow from a skeletal framework into this thing that swallowed stars, and that something in his breathing pattern had changed over those years. A slight wheeze on the exhale that suggested the recycled air was degrading his lungs. I learned that TK-347 sometimes shook during their shifts, a tremor so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't standing adjacent, and that the shaking had started after they'd been assigned to an execution detail. I learned not to ask about the executions. They happened regularly, quick, efficient processes that took place in specialized chambers deep within the detention levels, where bodies could be disposed of directly into the station's waste converters, becoming ash and then less than ash, their molecules broken down and recycled into the same air we breathe. I tried not to think about that. about how many people had been converted to air. They say, no one, vanity copy to air, about how every breath might contain atoms that had once been part of someone who'd mouthed, "Please help me," at a stormtrooper who'd watched them disappear. The thing about standing watch for 12 hours is that you can't completely shut down your mind. The breathing exercises help. The meditation techniques they taught us at the academy help. But there are always hours, usually hours 8 through 10, when consciousness refuses to maintain that careful distance from thought, and you start noticing things you shouldn't notice, thinking things you shouldn't think. I started noticing the prisoners' patterns. Our next day, and meditation or email copy, how they moved in their cells, what they did with their time, the ways they tried to maintain sanity in spaces designed to erode it. Some exercised, performing the same routine. Every day push-ups, sit-ups, stretches keeping their bodies functional even as their freedom disappeared. Some talked to themselves, having conversations with absent people, their lips moving constantly in dialogues that played out in the theatre of their isolation. Some just sat staring at the walls, with the kind of focus that suggested they'd found something there the rest of us couldn't see. And some not many, but some seemed to accept it, their fate, their cell, their situation. Watching Redodonan, out Nemo, watching Bill, and I just They ate when food was delivered, slept when lights dimmed fractionally during sleep cycles, used the waste disposal units with the same mechanical efficiency we used to maintain our weapons. They'd surrendered something essential, I thought. And I should know when you're redundant or killed. Some core part of themselves that insisted on resistance or hope, or the belief that their life belonged to them. They'd become prisoners the way I'd become a stormtrooper, not just in circumstance, but in nature, their identity reshaped by their environment until they were nothing but the role assigned to them. I wondered if I was supposed to admire that or pity it. Week 2, a prisoner in cell. A23, 79, attempted suicide. I didn't see the attempt itself It happened during a shift change, in the 3-minute gap between when I departed and my relief arrived, but I saw the aftermath. Medical servitors rushing into the cell, the prisoner on the floor with something that might have been blood pooling around them. The duty officers clipped commands over the comm system. They stabilized the prisoner. Wenchen Rain, Rashal and Keberi, Line Wichida, Kamindro, Lam Wayans of the prisoner, treated the wounds. Mineral, Wenchen, Wacharaki, Nitrit Thundeps, returned them to the cell in restraints that prevented arm movement. The prisoner sat there for the next 5 days, wrapped in devices that kept them alive against their will, staring at nothing. On day 6, the restraints came off. The prisoner made no further attempts. Wow, and Sichin, I knew the church metro at one on all Venacion, ordinary turned, just sat on the sleeping platform, existing, breathing, waiting for whatever came next. I thought about what it meant, that the Empire wouldn't let prisoners die on their own terms, that even in that final act of autonomy, we maintained control, preserved life, not because life was valued, but because death had to be administered according to protocol at the correct time through approved methods. The prisoner didn't own their death any more than they owned their captivity. Everything belonged to the system. Missionary, or our Tensendanesi, or Progamigota, Warigal, Nindugni, Wal, you will, share, one Dikshay. Week 3. I was reassigned to post 9 or 4th level, Eastern Quadrant, cells AA23 112 through AA 23 131. New cells, new prisoners, new faces pressing against viewports, or not pressing against viewports, new patterns to learn and catalogue and forget. One prisoner in this section was different. Cell AA23 119. A man, middle-aged, with the kind of bearing that suggested military training even through the grey jumpsuit. He never approached the viewport. Never paced or wrote on walls, or talked to himself. He did exercises, precise controlled movements that I recognized from my own combat training art. And between exercise sessions, he sat in perfect meditative posture, so still he might have been carved from stone. I watched him during my shifts, trying to understand what made him different. It wasn't peace. His face held too much tension for that. And it wasn't resignation. The exercises proved he was maintaining capability, preparing for something. No, what he had was purpose. Somehow, in that cell, stripped of freedom and facing almost certain death, he'd maintained a sense of purpose that existed independent of his circumstances. I envied him. My name is Sarah, coming up there. Or, we're bad season Neo. Then I hated him for making me feel envy. Then I felt nothing, because feeling was dangerous, and I'd learned to stop when the feeling started. Week 4. Rumors began circulating through the barracks. Whispers passed during armor maintenance. Fragments of conversation overheard in the mess hall, where we took our nutrition allotments. A rebel base had been discovered. The Death Star was preparing for its first operational test. We would be moving soon, departing the construction zones and entering combat capability. No official announcement came. Official announcement came, but the reactor hum changed, deepening in frequency, and the duty rotations increased to 14-hour shifts. More troopers appeared in the corridors, marching to stations throughout the ship, preparing for something that none of us fully understood, but all of us felt approaching like a pressure system before a storm. The prisoner, in cell LR 23-119, stopped exercising, started pacing instead, 3 steps forward, turn, 3 steps back, a pattern he repeated for hours. Something had changed in him too, I thought. Something in the air that we both sensed, though I couldn't name what it was. Week 50. Which is Sterry. At work under drum. I'll wink around aboard the Terry. The first test. Until out. Wishing there. Out down larkin. And wishing travel don't doubt. I wasn't anywhere near the observation level, so. Security Division personnel remained at our posts during operational protocol, so, but the entire station felt it happen. The reactor hum surged, climbing in frequency until it passed beyond hearing, into something you felt in your teeth, your bones, the base of your skull. The deck plates vibrated. Emergency lighting flickered for just a moment, and then, through the detention block's walls, through meters of reinforced durasteel and shielding, I felt something that shouldn't have been possible to feel. The discharge. It lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds of the station, channeling more energy than most planets generated in a year, focusing it through the super laser array, sending it across space Taunware. I didn't know. No. Nobody told us where. But somewhere, something had ceased to exist. A rebel base, probably. Or an asteroid. Or not. Or something else that the Empire had decided served no further purpose. The prisoners knew something had happened. They felt it too, that surge, that discharger, and in the hours after, they were more agitated than I'd ever seen them, pacing, shouting at their doors, throwing themselves against the walls of their cells as if they could break through sheer desperate force. The duty officer authorized sedation protocols. Within an hour, every cell was quiet again, filled with prisoners who lay on their sleeping platforms, breathing slowly, lost in chemical peace. All except cell AR 23-119. The man there had refused sedation somehow on. I don't know how. Maybe through force of will, maybe through technica. And when I looked through his viewport, he was standing at his door, looking directly at me. His eyes were different than the first prisoners had been. Metal Kanugara, and I need to Darpiko. Not pleading, not hopeful. Nain Cyril, Vanisha no brain. Just knowing. When soon, one direction Trista, knowing, as if he understood exactly what I was, what he was, what we were all part of, as if he'd made peace with it in a way that left no room for begging or bargaining. He nodded at me. Well, Mr. Director, a single, slow nod. Then returned to his sleeping platform and sat in his meditative posture, eyes closed, breathing controlled. I don't know why, but that nod affected me more than any plea could have. It felt like acknowledgement. Mature, at a dungeon, at Arberton Writing, like he'd seen through my armor and helmet to the person underneath, the one who still thought and wondered and felt things he shouldn't feel, and he was telling me he understood, that we were both prisoners here, just in different cells. I pushed the thought away. Mein Naturgenway, I'll travel to Merchant. Einstein the Chandra, I'll focused on my stance, my breathing, the duty that stretched ahead of me for 6 more hours. But the thought kept returning, sliding back into that space behind my eyes, where I couldn't completely control what's happened. What happened? Week 6, another test. Well, this one I felt more clearly. The build-up, the surge, the discharger, and this time the station moved afterward. Not fast, nothing like the hyperjump speeds capital ships achieve, but a slow, ponderous rotation that suggested we were repositioning, preparing for something larger. The rumours in the barracks intensified. We were going to Alderaan. Menisto, Mechisto, Alexandelicho. We were going to Coruscant. We were going to the Outer Rim to crush the rebellion at its source. Nobody knew for certain, but everyone had theories, and the theories spread through the trooper population like an infection, creating a kind of nervous energy that made shifts harder to endure. My duty rotation changed again. I was moved from detention, Block 23 entirely, reassigned to patrol circuits in Sector 7, near one of the station's primary hangar bays. The work was different walking instead of standing, covering kilometers of corridor during each shift, checking security checkpoints and monitoring for breaches that never came. But the essential nature remained the same. Hours of discipline and observation, watching for threats to order, maintaining the system through presence and force. The hangars were full. TIE fighters in their racks, transport shuttles waiting for deployment orders, atmospheric landers for ground operations. I watched pilots in their black flight suits, running through pre-flight checks, saw officers conferring over data pads that showed tactical displays I wasn't cleared to understand. The station was preparing for something significant. Even through the compartmentalization of the Imperial military structure, that much was obvious. I thought about the prisoner in cell A23, 119 sometimes, during the long walks between checkpoints. Wondered if he was still there, still sitting in his meditative posture, still maintaining that sense of purpose that had set him apart. Wondered what had happened to the woman who'd written on her walls, to the man with blue eyes who'd mouthed, "Please help me," to all the others who'd passed through those cells and then disappeared into execution chambers or interrogation rooms, or places I didn't have clearance to know about. Mostly, I tried not to wonder. Wondering was dangerous. Wondering meant you were still capable of caring, and caring made you weak, made you vulnerable to the kind of doubt that could spread through a mind like corrosion through metal. Week 7. The order came down through proper channels. All Security Division personnel were to return to their barracks and await further instructions. Shift rotations were suspended. The corridors began to empty as thousands of troopers marched back to their residential zones, leaving only essential posts manned. In the barracks, we waited. 200 of us silent, standing by our bunks in formation. Even though no officer was present to witness it, we'd been trained to maintain order even in the absence of direct command, to internalize the structure so completely that we became self-regulating. The wait lasted 3 hours. Then the announcement came, broadcast simultaneously to every speaker in every barracks throughout the station. Attention all personnel, the Death Star has entered the Alderaan system. Prepare for operational deployment. This is not a drill. Alderaan. Alderaan. I knew the namer. Everyone did. One of the core worlds, ancient and wealthy, with cities that were supposed to be beautiful in ways that military installations could never be. A center of culture and learning, or so the propaganda we'd been shown at the Academy claimed, before explaining why such places were threats to imperial order. Too much learning led to questions, and questions led to rebellion, and rebellion had to be stopped at its source. But Alderaan wasn't a rebel base. It was a planet. A whole planet, with billions of people, most of whom had probably never questioned imperial authority, never fired a weapon, never done anything except exist in the places where they'd been born. I pushed that down. No. How no? Returning Venice, Abercanay, brushed it. Because thinking about what operational deployment meant in relation to a planet, in relation to the Death Star's capability, meant thinking about things that would break something inside me that I'd spent weeks learning to keep intact. The announcement repeated. Cyril, my connection under a block. Anyone, Langdar, these even come down. Prepare for operational deployment. All personnel to battle stations. We moved. 200 troopers flowing out of the barracks in perfect formation, joining with other units in the corridors, merging into a river of white armor that flowed through the Death Star's veins toward our assigned stations. I was swept along with my division, back to Sector 7, to a checkpoint near the hangar, where I was ordered to maintain security protocols during the operation. The reactor hum was different now. Mission Tanker, but any time when not right, and I don't know. Mount and you, our wide searing. Deeper, Range Show, Mankara, one that back and loud too. Mission 7, legendary, Mama Dundar. More insistent. Building towards something that made the previous tests feel like practice, like warm-ups before the real performance. I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull, where primitive parts of my brain still understood danger, even when conscious thought had been trained to ignore it. I took my position. I know, you understand, watching bright here. Locked my boots. Mission, run around on Grease Stone. I will try to direction veteran, have I out. Locked my boots. Brought my E11 to ready. Around me, other troopers did the same, creating a perimeter around the hangar access points. Beyond the blast doors, I could hear the pilots preparing their fighters, the high whine of repulsor lift engines cycling through startup sequences. If there was resistance, if Alderaan had planetary defenses that could threaten the station, we'd be launching TIE squadrons to suppress them. But there was no resistance. The operation proceeded with the smooth efficiency of something that had been planned down to the second. I didn't see it happen then. My position faced away from any viewport, sir, but I felt it. The reactor surge lasted longer this time. One good artillery. Leave no we. 10 seconds, maybe 15. March Sarah, Arnarwell, and Ambero. The frequency climbed so high, it passed beyond sensation into something that existed only as pressure, as weight, as the feeling of reality bending around us. The station shuddered. Not violently, but enough to feel the magnitude of what was being released. The sheer scale of energy being channeled through systems designed by engineers who turned physics into theology. And then it was over. And then it was over. The reactor descended back to its normal frequency. The pressure released. The shuddering stopped. I still enter. No, shuddering stopped. Alderaan was gone. We're not into matter, no, Sharon. Wander on, let's go. Nobody said it. Wow. No announcement came. I was into our kids soak, but we all knew. You didn't discharge that much power for that long at a planet unless you were erasing it. The Death Star had done what it was designed to do, had fulfilled its purpose, had demonstrated the Empire's capability and will in the most absolute terms possible. I stood at my post, maintaining my stance, breathing in and out with the same rhythm I'd learned at the Academy. My hands didn't shake. I was said around. Then only to go. My legs didn't buckle. Now. My legs didn't buckle. My voice didn't cry out with the horror that was screaming somewhere deep inside me, in a place I couldn't let myself access. Billions of people, Rasera, at Azeret, or Chenturn, Nagwesh, na Durnstein, gone. One Joe, New Stare, Narrator, or about one Umbranio, not killed in combat, not executed after trial, not even suppressed through military occupation, but simply unmade. Every person who'd ever lived on that planet, everyone who'd been eating or sleeping or working or loving or dreaming. When the super laser hit, all of them converted to ash and vapor and expanding debris in the span of seconds. I thought about the prisoner in cell, AA-23119, the one who'd nodded at me with that look of knowing. I wondered if he'd been from Alderaan. If he'd felt his homeworld die through whatever mysterious connection people had to the places they came from, or maybe he'd expected it. Maybe that's what his meditation had been preparing for. The knowledge that resistance meant not just personal death, but total annihilation, the erasure of everything you'd ever known or loved. The shift continued. A shift continued. Hours passed. My relief eventually came, another trooper who took my position without comment, and I marched back to the barracks through corridors that hummed with the same reactor frequency they'd always hummed with, past other troopers who walked with the same perfect discipline they'd always walked with, through a station that had just murdered a planet and felt no different for it. In the barracks, nobody spoke. We removed our armor in the prescribed sequence, stored it in our lockers, climbed into our bunks. Above me, TK 7734 breathed with his usual rhythm. Around me, 199. Other troopers settled into their sleeping positions. The lights dimmed to night cycle levels. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, tried to activate the breathing exercises that were supposed to facilitate rapid unconsciousness. But sleep wouldn't come. No, behind my eyelids, I kept seeing things I hadn't actually seen. A planet breaking apart, cities falling into themselves, billions of lives ending simultaneously. I kept hearing things I hadn't actually heard, screams that would have been lost in vacuum, the sound of a world dying. I'd known what the Death Star was. We all had. They told us at the Academy, during the briefings, during the propaganda sessions, that explained why such a weapon was necessary. Fear would keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station. A galaxy, unified through strength, through the certainty that rebellion meant not just military defeat, but total destruction. But knowing something in abstract terms was different from feeling the station shudder beneath you, as it discharged enough power to shatter a planet. Or different from standing watch while billions of people who'd probably never even thought about rebelling ceased to exist because their leadership had made choices that the Empire considered threatening. I wondered how many Stormtroopers were lying in bunks throughout the Death Star right now, trying to sleep, trying not to think about what we'd just participated in. Thousands of us, all part of the security infrastructure that protected the station, maintained order, ensured the weapon could function. We hadn't fired the super laser ourselves. That was the weapons division, officers and technicians who'd trained specifically for that purpose. But we'd held the perimeter, maintained the systems, stood watch, while others pushed the buttons. We were all guilty. Or none of us were. Missinger, other initially. None of us were. I couldn't decide which was worse. The days after, Alderaan felt different, though I couldn't articulate exactly how. The station's routine remained the same. Shifts and duties and watches that bled together into an endless present-hour. But something had changed in the atmosphere, in the way troopers moved through corridors and the quality of the silence we maintained. Some troopers seemed energized by it. And a big Mansiga had mapped out. You could see it in their posture, the precision of their marching, the absolute certainty of their movements. They'd witnessed the Empire's ultimate power, and it had reinforced something in them, solidified their belief in the cause they served. Order had been maintained. Rebellion had been punished. The galaxy had learned what happened to those who opposed Imperial authority. Others moved differently. Slower. With a kind of careful attention to their actions that suggested they were concentrating harder than before, just to maintain protocol. I'd see them in the mess halls, sitting with their nutrition allotments untouched, staring at the walls, or in the barracks during rest periods, lying in their bunks with open eyes, breathing but not sleeping. Nobody talked about it. We'd been trained not to talk about operations, not to question orders, not to process events through discussion or shared emotion. Each of us had to integrate what had happened alone, in the privacy of our own thoughts, and either accept it or break under its weight. I noticed that TK3 3347, the one who'd developed the Tremorano, longer appeared for duty shifts. Their bunk was reassigned to a fresh transfer from Carida, a new recruit who moved with the kind of confidence that suggested they hadn't been on the station when Alderaan happened, hadn't felt the reactor surge or stood watch while a planet died. I wondered where TK 3347 had gone. Medical leave, maybe? Or enhancement procedures, or something worse that we weren't supposed to think about. My duty rotation changed again. I was assigned to patrol circuits in Sector 9, near what the station schematics labelled as Command and Controller, though I never saw inside those sections, never passed through the blast doors where officers made decisions and gave orders that determined which planets lived and which ones died. My job was to ensure those doors stayed secure, that nobody without proper clearance approached them, that the hierarchy remained intact. The corridors near Command were quieter than other sections. Fewer troopers, more officers, the kind of silence that came from everyone being acutely aware of their proximity to power. I'd walk my circuiter, checkpoint to checkpoint, 4 kilometers per loop, 12 loops per shifter, and sometimes I'd pass officers leaving the command sections, and I'd see things in their faces that their training didn't completely hide. Exhaustion, natural, strain, something that might have been doubt, though I didn't let myself look long enough to be certain. Even the ones giving orders were trapped in this, I thought. Even Grand Moff Tarkin himself, the man who'd commanded the destruction of Alderaan, whose authority extended over every living thing on this stationar, even he was trapped inside a system that demanded absolute commitment to its logic. Maybe he believed in it completely, felt no doubt about erasing planets to maintain order. Or maybe he was like us, going through the motions with perfect discipline, while something inside him slowly corroded under the weight of what he'd become. I pushed the thought away. Thinking about officers as human, as potentially conflicted or trapped, was dangerous. It suggested empathy, and empathy created connections, and connections created weakness. Weak, ailed. A new rumor began circulating. The rebels had stolen the Death Star's technical readouts. A security breach during construction. Information smuggled out and delivered to the rebellion. The rumor claimed there were vulnerabilities, design flaws that could theoretically be exploited. No official statement addressed the rumors, But the security protocols intensified. Random inspections increased. Not only during, not actually though, not that I know what you're at, Mr. Ira, and only trying to say internal checkpoints that had been semi-permeable became absolute barriers, requiring additional clearance to pass. The duty officers began questioning troopers during shift changes. Casual questions, seemingly random, about loyalty and commitment, and whether we'd heard anything unusual in the barracks. I answered every question with the same words I'd learned at the academy. My duty is to the Empire. My loyalty is absolute. The duty officer would nod, mark something on his datapad, and dismiss me. I never knew if I'd said the correct thing, or if my name was being added to some list for additional monitoring. The prisoner in cell A23 119 appeared in my thoughts sometimes during the long patrol circuits when my mind drifted despite my best efforts. I hadn't seen him in weeks, hadn't been back to detention block A23 since my reassignment, but I found myself wondering if he was still there, still sitting in meditation, still maintaining that sense of purpose I'd envied. Probably not. Probably he'd been interrogated, broken, executed, his body converted to ash and recycled into the station's life support systems. That was the most logical conclusion. Now, I see that that's I don't know the carry. Prisoners didn't stay in detention blocks forever, or blocks forever. They were processed one way or another, their information extracted, and their existence terminated once they'd served whatever purpose Imperial intelligence determined they had. But I wanted to believe he was still there, still sitting. One and nine zero. I need to turn out, Margarita and Danister, still breathing with control and purpose, still, somehow, free inside his captivity. In a way, I wasn't free inside mine. We, 9-2. The station moved. Not repositioning our actual transit, through hyperspace, jumping from the Alderaan system to somewhere else. The entire structure shuddered during the jump, and for a moment I felt the disorientation that came from moving faster than light, inside a vessel that wasn't designed for comfortable transit. The Death Star could move between systems, but it wasn't a ship in the normal sense. It was a station with engines, a weapon with propulsion, a thing that defied the normal categories. When we emerged from hyperspace, the gravity felt different, lighter. The reactor hum had a new overtone. We'd arrived somewhere with a different mass shadow, a different stellar environment. No announcement explained where we were or why. My duty continued, without interruption. Same circuits, same checkpoints, same 12-hour shifts walking corridors that all looked identical whether we were in the core worlds or the outer rim. But something was different. I could feel it in the way officers moved, the increased frequency of pilot scrambles in the hangars, the tension that accumulated in the air like static before a storm. We were preparing for combat, real combat, not just demonstrations against defenseless planets. The rebels were coming. Somehow I knew that. Maybe from the rumors, maybe from the increased security protocols, maybe from something deeper. The way prey animals sense predators approaching even before they appear. The Death Star had made itself the symbol of everything the rebellion opposed, and they were going to try to destroy it. Part of me, small part, buried deep where I tried not to look, hoped they'd succeed. I crushed that thought immediately, pushed it down into the darkness, where treasonous ideas went to be smothered. I was a Stormtrooper. My duty was to the Empire. The Death Star was the ultimate expression of Imperial power, and I would defend it with my life because that's what I'd been trained to do, what I'd been made to do. But the thought didn't quite die. It squirmed there in the darkness, refusing to be completely silenced, whispering questions I couldn't afford to answer. What if the rebels were right? What if the Empire I served was wrong? What if Alderaan had been murder instead of military necessity? What if I was complicit in something so terrible that no amount of discipline or duty could justify it? No. No. No, Mr. But stop. But those thoughts led to madness or treason, or both. I focused on my breathing, on my steps, on the checkpoint markers that guided my patrol circuit. I focused on being TK 4811. Nothing more and nothing less. A weapon in human form, doing what weapons do. Week 10, Mount Shonen. The alert came during my rest period, blaring through the barracks speakers, all personnel to battle stations. The station is under attack. This is not a drill. We scrambled into armor, faster than I thought possible. Months of drill and practice, collapsing the process into pure muscle memory. 200 troopers dressed simultaneously. The barracks filling with the sound of plastoid plates clicking into place, weapons being charged, helmets sealing with their soft hisses. I was in full armor and moving toward the door before I'd consciously processed what the alert meant. The rebels were here, they were attacking, and the Death Star, this structure that could destroy Planet South, was about to become a battleground. My unit deployed to Sector 7, reinforcing the hangar defenses as TIE fighters scrambled to intercept the rebel attack. Through the hangar's atmosphere containment field, I could see them on small craft, tiny compared to the Death Star's mass, darting and weaving with an agility our fighters couldn't match. X-Wings and Y-Wings, the Rebellion's signature craft, moving with the desperate precision of people who knew they were attacking something that could vaporize their entire fleet with a single super laser discharge. But the super laser wasn't firing. I could feel the reactor cycling, building charge, but something was wrong with the timing, the rhythm. The station had been designed to destroy planets, not engage in fighter combat. The rebels had found the seam in our capability, had discovered that our ultimate weapon was useless against targets, too small and fast for it to track. The battle developed around us. TIE fighters exploded in silent flashes beyond the hangar field. Rebel craft made attack runs, firing at the station's surface defenses, dodging the massive turbolaser batteries that tried to track them. And we stood there, we 1,000 stormtroopers, stationed throughout the hangar levels, weapons ready, guarding against boarding actions that might never come. I watched a Y-wing take a direct hit from a turbolaser, saw it come apart in a sphere of expanding debris and fire. Inside that debris was a pilot, maybe a crew, people who'd chosen to fly toward a weapon that had destroyed a planet, knowing the odds of survival were almost zero. They'd chosen it anyway, because they believed in something strongly enough to die for it. I'd never been given a choice. I just back, Manchester Admado, Adamatua, Mila, Petronziwakwa, Acho, in days of Clort, had never been given a choice. The Empire had taken me during the Academy's recruitment sweep, identified me as suitable for military service, trained me and conditioned me and shaped me into this. I'd never been asked if I believed in the cause, never given the option to refuse. My service wasn't chosen up. It was assigned, mandated, enforced through systems that turned resistance into something that couldn't exist. But they'd chosen. Every rebel out there, in every fighter making attack runs against impossible odds, had chosen to be there, had weighed the cost, and decided that some things were worth dying for. Another explosion. Another craft gone. The battle continued. Then something changed. The reactor hum surged in a way I hadn't felt before. Not the build-up to super laser discharge, but something else, something wrong. The lights flickered. The hangar's atmosphere field wavered. I took the ration, and down then, Henry Salkshi, and Mostal. Through my helmet comm, I heard fragments of emergency communications. our breach in Sectora, our chain reaction. The deck tilted. Our mercury, the restento, when the rocket chopping, having new gungal and Java go. Just slightly, just a few degrees, but enough to feel the massive structure's equilibrium shifting. Something had been damaged, something critical, and the Death Star. This weapon that could destroy planets was wounded. Around me, troopers maintained their positions, even as the station groaned like a living thing in pain. We'd been trained for this, drilled in emergency protocols, taught to maintain order even as our environment failed. But I could sense the fear underneath the discipline, could feel it in the slightly too fast breathing I heard through the comm channels, in the way some troopers' grips on their weapons had tightened beyond what protocol required. The evacuation order came through official channels, all non-essential personnel to escape pods. Essential personnel maintained posts until relieved. Security division was essential. When we weren't going anywhere. Our job was to maintain order during the evacuation, ensure that officers and critical crew reached the escape pods first, prevent panic from collapsing the withdrawal into chaos. So we stood there, weapons ready, guarding corridors that led to escape pods we wouldn't be using, watching as pilots and technicians and officers ran past us towards salvation. The tilt increased. I know, and literally know in what, and it's a name, Winston Kropico, and this time, Ben Guru. Whatever damage had been inflicted was propagating, spreading through systems, creating failures that cascaded into more failures. The reactor hum had become irregular, stuttering, the steady rhythm I'd learned to sleep, to transformed into something arrhythmic and terrible. Through my helmet's comm channel, I heard TK9 9021, the one who'd been on the station since construction began, speak for the first time. In weeks it's the reactor. They've hit the reactor. We are! Static cut him off. Or maybe he'd stopped himself, realizing that saying what we were would make it real in a way that silence couldn't. But I knew. Well, we all knew. I don't want to with jets. The Death Star was dying. This structure that had taken years to build, that had required resources from 100 systems, that represented the Empire's ultimate power. It was coming apart. The rebels had found a weakness, exploited a vulnerability, and now the weapon that had destroyed Alderaan was being destroyed in turn. The irony was so sharp it felt like physical pain. More evacuation orders. No, occupation. More personnel rushing past our positions. The officer who'd inspected my detention block posts weeks ago ran past me. His uniform no longer perfectly pressed, his face showing something I'd never seen in an Imperial officer before. Pure, undiluted terror. He didn't acknowledge us, didn't give orders, just ran toward the escape pods like every other living thing fleeing death. Maintain positions. The command came through our helmet comms. A duty officer somewhere, still following protocol, even as the station died around us. Security division, maintain positions. Not guard. We maintained, because that's what we were trained to do, what we'd been made to do, even knowing that maintaining position meant staying aboard a station that was about to explode, about to release all the energy stored in its reactor. In one catastrophic discharge, we maintained. The deck tilted further. 45 degrees now, maybe more. My maglocked boots held me to the deck plate, but I could see debris sliding past. Equipment that hadn't been secured properly tumbling toward the hangar's atmosphere field. Some of it passed through the field, expelled into space, joining the expanding cloud of wreckage that surrounded the station. Through the field, I could still see the battle. And up arrow, and Nidstero, and battle wagon. Fewer TIE fighters now. Window. I'll let you know than Tadoki, Marangbane. More rebel craft, breaking away, accelerating out of the engagement zone. They knew what was coming. They triggered it, and now they were escaping the blast radius, leaving us to die in the weapon we'd served. Another command. All security division personnel, withdraw to escape pods. Authorization code Omega 7. The authorization code meant the order was genuine, that some officer somewhere had decided we'd fulfilled our purpose and could be released to save ourselves. But the escape pods were 2 sectors away, through corridors that were probably already compromised, in a station that was tilting at angles that made movement nearly impossible. I unlocked my mag boots. Well, we shouldn't know that, and surrender, unless you unlock, and I'll stay on, as some in new stage, and our air started moving, joining the flow of other troopers who were doing the same, all of us abandoning our posts for the first time since our assignment began. We ran and marched, ran out through corridors that shook with internal explosions, past sections where atmosphere was venting through breaches, over debris and around fires that burned in colours that weren't natural. Ahead of me, TK 7734 stumbled, fell, and I grabbed his arm to pull him back to his feet without thinking, without calculating whether stopping would decrease my own survival odds. He nodded out, quick, sharp gesturing. We kept running together, 2 stormtroopers among thousands who were all making the same desperate journey toward escape. The corridor to the escape pod bay was blocked. A bulkhead had collapsed, sealing the passage, leaving us in a section that had no other route out. Around me, troopers were checking their data pads, looking for alternate paths, trying to find another way. But I knew, with the same certainty I'd felt when the station moved through hyperspace, that there was no other way. This was where my service ended, not in combat, not in execution, but in a corridor deep inside a dying weapon, surrounded by other troopers who'd been trained so well to obey that we'd stood our posts until escape became impossible. TK 7734 removed his helmet. I'd never seen his face before. Never seen any trooper's face except my own. He was young, maybe younger than me, with the same pale skin and hollow eyes that came from years of service in recycled air. He looked at me and said, "I'm from Alderaan. Nice show. That's from Nyokri, Stabaturan, Apnidolan, Nukradol and Nature, allowed stay." 4 words. 4 words that rewrote everything I'd assumed about him. About service, about what it meant to be a stormtrooper standing watch while your homeworld died. "I volunteered," he continued, his voice strange and rough from disuse. 5 years ago, before the academy. I believed in order, in peace, in what the Empire promised. And then I stood watch while they killed everyone I'd ever known. Everyone. And I didn't. I couldn't. He stopped. Nyoro, I am dead. Now. Looked at the collapsed bulkhead. Looked back at me. Ring Ristimo. Marnensizana. Nishenkur. Matro Nigo. Mookstakes. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "Oh, I know. One unit in one. One D. I'm glad this thing is dying. I'm glad I'll die with it. It's the first thing that's made sense in months." I removed my own helmet then, breaking protocol for the first time since Karida, letting the recycled air hit my face directly. It smelled like smoke and ozone, and that sharp scent of overheated metal. It smelled like the end. Around us, other troopers were removing their helmets too, revealing faces I'd never seen, identities I'd never known existed. We were all here, all trapped in this corridor, and for the first time since becoming TK 4008 and 11, I was among people instead of numbers. Someone laughed. A strange, slightly hysterical sound. That shouldn't have been possible in this moment, but somehow was. Someone else sat down against the wall, legs pulled up to chest, rocking slightly. Someone else began reciting something. A prayer, maybe, though religion was discouraged in Imperial service. I sat down too. My legs gave out, and I sat down against the corridor wall, and felt the station shaking itself apart around me, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The academy. The training. One Doshidar or while, or at least some correction, the all, and Jango Arnold. The conditioning that turned me into a weapon. Or the transportation to the Death Star. The shifts in detention block at 23, watching prisoners who'd mouthed, "Please help me," at a stormtrooper who couldn't help. The moment I'd felt Alderaan die, felt the reactor surge, and known that billions of people had just been erased by the weapon I'd served. The prisoner who'd nodded at me. "Right, Sarah, I don't know. The one who'd sat in meditation, maintaining purpose, even in captivity. I understood now what that nod had meant. Recognition of our shared imprisonment, acknowledgement that we were both trapped in systems larger than ourselves, both doing our best to maintain dignity while forces beyond our control determined our fates. He'd been free, in a way I hadn't been. Because he'd chosen his captivity through resistance, through refusing to comply, through maintaining something essential, even when it cost him everything. While I'd surrendered without ever realizing I was surrendering, I'd let myself be shaped into compliance so complete that I'd stood watch while planets died and called it duty. The reactor surge was building towards something final now. I could feel it in the deck plates, in the air itself, in the way reality seemed to be compressing around us. This was it. The Death Star's last moments, and mine with it. TK 7734. The man from Alderana reached over and took my hand. A simple gesture, human contact between two people who'd been trained to remain separate, isolated, reduced to our functions. His hand was warm. His grip was firm. And I said Taladimane, and Nimni down sickner. Well, and the trainer. He was here with me at the end, and that meant something, even if I couldn't articulate what. Other troopers reached out too, finding each other in the darkness, creating a web of connection that had been denied to us during all our months of service. We'd been kept apart deliberately, made into individuals who couldn't bond or conspire, or develop the kind of loyalty to each other that might supersede loyalty to the Empire. But here, at the end, we'd found each other anyway. I thought about the Empire I'd served. The Order it claimed to represent. The peace it promised through force so overwhelming that resistance became impossible. I'd believed in that once, or thought I'd had, or had been conditioned to believe I believed. But what kind of peace required weapons that could destroy planets? What kind of order demanded that people like me stand watch while billions died? What kind of system called that necessary and just and good? The station lurched. Alright. The reactor surged, peaked. The lights went out. In the darkness, someone was still reciting their prayer. Or actually no, someone else was crying, the sound muffled by the walls and the distance, but still audible. TK 7734's hand gripped mine tighter. "I'm sorry," I said to him, to all of them, to the prisoners I'd watched, and the people of Alderaan and everyone who'd been crushed beneath the Empire's absolute order. "I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I stood watch. I'm sorry, Io." The reactor went critical. There was light, more light than should have been possible, light that penetrated through walls and armor and flesh, light that was heat and force, and the end of everything. There was sound that transcended sound, became pressure, became something that existed beyond the range of human perception. There was a momenta, infinitely long and infinitely briefer, where I felt the Death Star coming apart around me, felt its vast mass fragmenting into debris, felt the energy that had destroyed Alderaan being released all at once in an explosion that would be visible from systems away, and there was a strange sense of peace. Because I'd been trapped in this, trapped by duty and obedience, and a system that turned people into weapons, but I wasn't trapped anymore. Because the weapon was dying, and I was dying with it, and whatever came next couldn't possibly be worse than what I'd been part of. TK 77,000. 34's hand was still in mine when the light consumed us. And then there was nothing. Wow, where's nothing? Nothing, except the memory of stars disappearing. Nothing, except the echo of a reactor, hum that had been the rhythm of my captivity. Nothing, except the understanding of, too late, always too late, that I had been a prisoner all along, just in a different kind of cell, and that freedom had required this, the destruction of the thing I'd served, the end of the structure that had given my obedience meaning. The Death Star died. and I should mistake much done worship, more than that. I'll let a nation or not photographs. And with it died TK 401811, who'd once had a name, who'd once been someone's son, who'd been shaped into a weapon, and used to maintain order aboard a station that destroyed planets, who'd stood watch while people mouthed, "Please help me" at him, who'd felt a world die and called it duty, who'd marched and stood until the moment when service became impossible, and Olaine was the human thing underneath the armor, reaching out to me. I remember the first time I saw the stars disappear. I remember standing in formation while something vast moved between us and the galaxy. I remember the smell of ozone and recycled air. I remember the reactor hum that never stops. I remember Cell, AA-23, 119, and the man who nodded at me with understanding. I remember standing watch while a planet died. I remember the moment I realized I'd been a prisoner all along. I remember CK 7734's hand in mine. I remember the lights, and I remember, at the very end, understanding what the prisoner in Cell AA-23-119 had known all along. That purpose could exist independent of circumstances, that dignity could be maintained even in captivity, that being human meant something more than following orders, something that required choice and conscience and the willingness to say no even when saying no cost everything. I never got to say no. But in that final moment, holding hands with other troopers in a darkened corridor, while a weapon came apart around us, I think I finally understood what no would have meant, what it would have cost, what it would have saved. What? The Death Star is gone now, scattered into debris and radiation and ash, and somewhere in that expanding cloud of wreckage are the atoms that used to be me, mixing with the atoms that used to be TK 7734, and all the others who'd served this thing, becoming part of the dust that drifts between stars. Maybe some of those atoms will eventually fall to a planet's surface. Maybe they'll become part of soil, part of water, part of something living that grows under a sun instead of reactor light. Maybe in some distant future, what used to be stormtroopers will become trees or grass or flowers, transformed from weapons into something that exists without violence, without duty, without the endless obligation to obey. I'd like to think that's possible. That's possible. I'd like to think that even atoms can be redeemed. I'd like to think that even atoms can be redeemed, but I'll never know. Because this is where my story ends, in a corridor, deep inside a dying weapon, holding the hand of a man from Alderaan, understanding too late what I'd been part of, what I'd enabled, what I'd allowed myself to become through obedience so complete it erased every other possibility. If you're listening to this, if somehow these words have survived when I didn't know, then understand this: duty is not enough. Order is not enough. Following commands is not enough. Being a good soldier is not enough. Because I was a good soldier. I followed every order, maintained every protocol, stood every watch. I did everything the Empire asked of me, did it with precision and discipline and absolute commitment, and all it made me was complicit in murder, on a scale so vast that my mind couldn't fully comprehend it, even as I felt it happening. The Empire will tell you that order is necessary, that peace requires strength, that sacrifice serves a greater good. They'll train you and condition you and shape you into someone who believes these things without questioning, who stands watch while planets die and calls it necessary. Don't let them take the part of you that knows deep down, before the conditioning, before the training, that some things are wrong, no matter how many orders justify them. Don't let them make you into what they made me. Much staring like Harden. I don't eat much. Don't let them turn you into a weapon, and then blame the weapon for the deaths it causes. Don't stand watch while people die. Unrechen, Manage, Nanishach the nation, only do. Hunter, Nessin, I know not K, A, and don't maintain position while your humanity erodes. Don't follow orders that require you to ignore the screaming. Nanishang that in done, Nanzang Nakran Kagnar is screaming. Say no. Nisanero, Benatel, and I start, Alumni, already said, even when no means death. Worship, man, count man, Nisanero, I know that shit could sell, and now, because death, as yourself, is better than survival, as something you were never meant to be. I learned that too late. Maybe you won't. Maybe somewhere, someone will hear this and understand, and choose differently than I was able to choose, and resist where I was trained not to resist. Maybe that will be enough, or maybe it won't matter at all. Maybe the Empire will keep building weapons, keep training soldiers, keep destroying anyone who threatens order. Maybe there will always be Death Stars, and always be Stormtroopers standing watch aboard them, serving systems they don't understand in service of goals they were never allowed to question. I don't know. What I know is this: I was TK 4811. I served aboard the Death Star. Legendary, Alistair, Nathan died alone. I stood watch while Alderaan died. And at the end, in the darkness, I reached for human connection and found it. And in that moment, I was more myself than I'd been in all my months of perfect service. It's not much of a legacy. I could say that now. Never a Kabajian, and it's down to call, but it's all I have. Mingo, that I'm the Shantimarikar, accept Tune. Brighton, ride Nunchville. The stars disappeared when the Death Star moved between us and the galaxy. They reappeared when the Death Star died. And somewhere out there, they're still burning up, indifferent to empire or rebellion, to order or chaos, to the tiny struggles of living things, who serve and resist and die in the spaces between worlds. I saw them once, those stars. I'll never see them again. But they're still there. And maybe that means something. Maybe that's enough. The reactor hum has stopped. The light has faded. There's only silence now. Silence, and the memory of a hand holding mine. You got an circuit card. Nourish the struck not she stand up and out, and a mile. Must it, Alex Steinmore, Nilne, Chase. Silence, and the understanding that came too late. Silence and the hoper, however small, however unlikely, that someone, somewhere, will choose differently. Will say, no. Harnish Sel will be free. Willajero. Nanester would be free. Mine. This is TK 1811, signing off. This is what it was like to be a Stormtrooper on the Death Star. This is what it cost. Mine merit. Down, I ain't up go. Remember us. I don't remember, but yes, not as heroes. Mission throw, round down, Tatum Govin, Land don't say gay, and why can donate? No, not as villains. What's your anger tried? Then my stunning impression, not as sick legs. Just as people who were trapped inside something larger than ourselves, doing our best to survive, to maintain dignity, to hold on to some fragment of humanity, even as it was systematically erased. Remember us, or go, arrest and read up, and do better. Well,